So, the next time you get into an argument with your wife or your friends, or with a small group of friends, stop the discussion for a moment and for an experiment institute this rule. Well, you also don't have to be that formal about it. You can just do it once you know the game. Each person can speak up for himself only after he has first restated the ideas and feelings of the previous speaker accurately and to that speaker's satisfaction. Now that's so cool, because here's the typical argument. So we're arguing, I want to win, and so you tell me a bunch of things, and so then I take those things and I turn them into the stupidest possible representation of those things. You know, I weaken your argument and make you look like a fool, and then I destroy it. And that's a straw, that's by that, you're making your opponent into a straw man. That's the straw man argument, right? You take what they're telling you and you caricature it, and that way you can make them look absurd and make them be ashamed, and then, of course, you've set up this skinny little opponent that you can just demolish with one punch. It's really crooked, and it shows that you're a coward, because what it means is you have to have an opponent that's, you know, crippled and thin and starving and inarticulate before you could possibly win, before you could possibly progress. It's a pathetic way of having an argument. What you should do is listen to the person and help them make their argument as strong as you possibly can. And then deal with that. Because then you're sure that you're taking them seriously. So, and to that speaker's satisfaction. Well, that's so cool, eh? So we're having an argument. I don't know, maybe we have an argument about who's going to be responsible for grocery shopping or for doing the dishes or for cooking or any of those domestic things that continually cause couples to be at each other's throat. It's like, so you'll have some arguments about why you should do whatever it is that you're going to do. And in order for the argument to progress, I have to tell you back what you said. And you have to agree that I put it properly. Well, that's so annoying. Like, it just runs so contrary to what you want to do. Because, of course, you want to make the other person sound stupid so you can beat them. This way you can't do that, because you have to listen well enough so you actually understood what they said. And then you have to formulate their argument so that they're willing to agree that that actually constitutes their argument. Well, that's really, it's difficult. But it's so useful, because first of all, it does mean that you understood them. And second, it immediately indicates to them that you're not just trying to win. You're trying to listen. And then they're much less likely to get all irritable and angry at you, because at least you're trying to listen. You're not making them into a fool. And, you know, often when people are trying to tell you what they want, because they're all afraid of telling you what they want, because, you know, maybe they never got what they wanted in their whole life, you know, if they've had a history of bad relationships and poor parenting and that sort of thing. They're just bloody terrified to tell you that they might actually want something. And so, as soon as you indicate to them that you actually heard what they said, and you're willing to take it seriously enough to formulate it properly, well then it's like one step towards trust. I see, you did listen. You at least know where I'm coming from. It's like, that doesn't mean you agree, you know. Just because you understand someone's argument doesn't mean you have to agree, but at least you know what the argument is. You see what this would mean. So one of the things Rogers does continually in his therapy, and I do this a lot, is like I listen to the person, and they kind of go through a narrative, a spontaneous narrative, often following a chain of associations, as Freud pointed out. They'll tell me a spontaneous narrative, and I'll say, okay, it sounds to me like this is what you said. And I'll try to, you know, lay out the argument. And maybe now and then I'll ask for clarification if there's a part I didn't understand, or if I see that there's a part that seems contradictory. You know, they said this thing here and this thing there, and I'll tell them that. You know, it seems to me that you said this here, and I'm not sure how to put those together. I don't say, well, that makes your argument, you know, incoherent. I say, well, I don't get how to understand that. And they kind of go, oh, yeah, because people will admit to that if you just point it out flatly, you know. It's like, I'm not involved, I'm just listening. It's not my problem, it's a problem. And that's another thing that's useful too. The other person is entitled to their suffering. You don't get to take it away, it's their destiny. So you can listen to their problems without having to think that, you know, you have to take them on as if they're yours. You have to mirror them, but it's their problem. It's like they have to figure it out, and that's good. You need a problem to figure out. It's not necessarily a terrible thing that they have a problem. It would simply mean that before presenting your own point of view, it would be necessary for you to really achieve the other speaker's frame of reference, to understand his thoughts and feelings so well that you could summarize them for him. And that's useful too, because, you know, the way we remember things is if you tell me a long story, and I tell it back to you. I do not tell it back to you. What happens is I listen to it, and I try to figure out what the thread of the argument is. And then when I tell it back to you, it's way shorter and tighter. And that means in some sense it's got all the essentials, but it's got less of the baggage. Right? That's what you're kind of doing when you ask someone to get to the point. So they tell you this long story. It's like this tree that it's full of dead branches and it hasn't been pruned, and there it's standing there, and you know, maybe the living branches you can hardly even see, but you're concentrating on them, and then when you tell it back to them, you just tell them the part of the story that's alive. And they listen to that, and they think, oh yes, that's what I meant. And then that means you've changed the memory, right? If they agree, you've changed the memory. You've divested it of all the excess baggage, just like pruning. And that's what you're doing. And so that dialogue it's mental hygiene. And that's what people do. You know, you've got to wonder, well, why do we talk? Well, it's to exchange information. Yeah, and there's utility in it. You know, like if you know how to do something and I don't, you can tell me. But that isn't the sort of thing that people are doing most of the time. Most of the time they're telling their stories. This is what happened to me. Right? And then the other person will say, well, this is what happened to me. And there's this mutual attempt to organize. That's how people are organizing their brains. We organize our brains by talking. That's how people are organizing their brains. We organize our brains by talking. And so if you don't have someone to listen to you, well, especially if it's over a few decades, you're going to have a brain that's like a whole forest of trees that it needs a forest fire. It doesn't need just some, you know, trimming. It's really in trouble. So you need to have someone to listen to you. And the best way to get someone like that is to find a bunch of people and listen to them. Because, you know, of course, then that's a friendship. That's a real friendship, you know, because you're both trying to move towards a better place, whatever that place is. And it's a great relationship then. The part of the brain that you use reading, the visual cortex is back here, and then the auditory cortex is about here. And then the part of the brain that you use for silent reading is where the auditory and the visual cortex overlap. So that's pretty cool. So what it means is that you look at words and you hear them, because your eyes are using the auditory cortex as a representational structure. So that's pretty cool. And so it turns out that people who silent read pretty much use the same brain area to do that. And so you might think about that as biological preparedness in some sense, but of course people didn't learn to read silently till 500 years ago, roughly speaking. You know, even the earliest literate people, most of them read out loud. Silent reading was a very, very rare phenomenon. Julius Caesar could read silently, and people thought that that was part of his magical power. Because it's pretty damn weird, you know, that you can use your eyes to hear. You know, because you can all do it. You think, yeah, anybody can do that. But, you know, it's a pretty new thing on the evolutionary horizon. And to be able to hear with your eyes, it's like, good work, guys. That's not an easy thing to manage. So anyways, the brain has specialized subsystem, but it's a dynamic biological system, so you can muck about with it quite a bit, and it'll set itself up in slightly different ways. So the systems aren't necessarily localized exactly the same place in everyone, but roughly speaking, everyone has those systems, and roughly speaking, they're in the same place across people. Now, there's a lot of variability, and it's one of the things that makes, you know, MRI studies and the like very difficult to interpret, because if you average across a lot of people, what it means is you blur things out, you know, because you can only extract out the commonalities. And although, you know, they're getting better and better at dealing with that. So, okay. So, there's other ways that you can think about the brain too. These are all approaches to understanding it, you know. I would say it's a very, very complex thing. In fact, it's the most complex thing there is. You know, there are more patterns of combinations of neural connections in your brain than there are subatomic particles in the universe. So you are, I know you won't believe that because it doesn't seem possible, but you can do the math and you'll figure out that it's actually right. So you're the most complicated thing there is, and by a lot. And so in some sense, there's more space inside your head than there is space outside your head. It depends on how you conceptualize space, you know, because you can conceptualize space as the number of ways that something can be configured, and that's state space. And that's a magnitude measurement, you know, and the distance between things, well, that's another way of conceptualizing space. But if you want to think about big, what's inside you is, I think that it's bigger than what's outside you. It's certainly that way in terms of complexity, unless you factor in the other brains. You know, so that's very much worth thinking about. It means that, you know, what we don't understand about the brain is going to fill many, many books. And one of the things we really don't understand is consciousness. People just don't get that. And it doesn't really look, you know, you might think that consciousness is an emergent, late evolutionary function, you know, but it doesn't really look like that. You know, I mean, even when people become demented and you lose almost all of their higher cortical function, there's no doubt that they're still conscious. And so consciousness might be way, way, way older than we think. And in fact, I think it's highly probable. I don't think a hypothalamic cat is unconscious. It's certainly awake, you know, and distinguishing between awake and conscious is no easy thing. You might say, well, animals aren't conscious. It's like, well, you know, here's the thing. You know, what people normally think is that humans are different than other animals, and so before you anthropomorphize an animal, you should be careful. But I think that's complete rubbish. I think it's exactly the opposite. Before you assume that humans have attributes that animals don't, you have to prove it. Because there's continuity. Tremendous, tremendous continuity. And so, it's right to anthropomorphize animals. What's wrong is to presume a priori that humans are qualitatively different. Now, there are some very bizarre things about us, obviously. You know, we have opposable thumbs. That's a big deal. We can grip things. That's a massive deal, you know. And it turns out that there's another, your brain maps your body onto its surface, onto its motor strip and its sensory strip, which are roughly here on the brain. And if you take the motor strip or the sensory strip and you make a representation of how it represents the body, which is called a homunculus, Wilder Penfield did this first at McGill University. I don't know if you know this, and perhaps you'll be fortunate enough to experience it, but people who have brain surgery are conscious when it happens. And that's so that the surgeons can figure out whether this little part is doing anything important before they take it out. You know, it's a very horrific thought. But Penfield, when he did some of the early psychosurgery for epilepsy, because in intractable epilepsy, sometimes the only thing to do is radical surgery, like you cut the corpus callosum, for example, so that the electrical storm, so to speak, can't transmit across the hemispheres and the whole brain won't be affected. But while he was doing that, he used a little electrode to map out the surface of the brain, and he mapped out the motor strip, which is just behind the prefrontal cortex, and then the sensory strip, which is just behind that, to find out how the body represented, or the brain represented the body. And basically what he showed was that on the motor strip, you know, the thumb has as much representation as your whole trunk. So basically your thumb is as smart from a motoric perspective, smarter, than you from here to here. You know, well, try picking up something with your back, you know, and you'll figure out exactly why that is. And the thumb basically has almost as much representation as the rest of the hand, but the hands are like gigantic balloons, you know, and the arms are little skinny sticks here and here. Feet are fairly highly represented, especially in the sensory cortex, because you know you got to be careful about what you step on. And one of the things that's very interesting about the representation of the feet on the sensory strip is that it's right beside the representation of the genitalia, and so there's crosstalk. And so some of you are pretty into foot massages, and that's why. You know, so it's a consequence of the overlap. Now, why that overlap is there, I don't know exactly. You know, maybe the brain had organized itself so particularly sensitive surfaces were taking advantage of the same tissue, something like that. But, you know, it's an interesting case of, it's like synesthesia in a sense. It's like sensory synesthesia. So, as far as your brain's concerned, you're all hands, and your hands are almost all thumb, and you're quite a bit of feet, and your lips are massive, and so is your tongue, and your face is very highly represented too. So basically, as far as your brain is concerned, with regards to sensory input and motor output, you're this huge face with great big lips and tongue, and you have massive balloon-like hands, and your feet are pretty big too. And there's a fair bit of sensory representation for the genitalia as well, and then the body's hardly there at all. So that's kind of what a human being is like, right? We're all thumbs and hands, and we talk about what we do with our thumbs and hands all the time. And we take things apart with them, and we put them together, and then we tell everybody else how we're doing that. And that's basically a human being. And when you're thinking about the difference between human beings and highly encephalized mammals, like dolphins and whales, because people have claimed that dolphins and whales are extraordinarily intelligent, and dolphins don't seem particularly simple-minded, but look at the things. They're in these test tube-shaped bodies. What are they going to do? Flip sand up into buildings? It's like they can't manage that. And so the manner in which their nervous system is embodied turns out to be extraordinarily important when you're trying to understand something like the relationship between cortical tissue mass and intelligence. You can't just think about mind as something that's floating like a soul in space. If it isn't stuck in something that you can use, it's not particularly good for anything, or anything that human beings would regard as particularly intelligent. Okay. So that's kind of a... Oh, here's another way that you can think about the brain. You can also think about it as divided. This is sort of a schema that it was more popular with the Russian neuropsychologists, but it's a pretty good one. You can think about the front part of the brain as being concerned with motor output. And so there's the motor strip that allows you to sequence activities, and then, to make these kinetic melodies that are chains of things that you know how to do. And then in front of that is the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex grew out of the motor cortex. And that's pretty interesting, because if you think about that from an evolutionary perspective, what that implies is that thought is abstracted action. Right, because that's where it came from. And so basically what you're doing when you're thinking is you're figuring out action sequences that you could implement and modeling their consequences and evaluating them before you implement them in behavior. And that's why, I think it was Alfred North Whitehead, though I might be getting that wrong, he said, we think so that our thoughts can die instead of us. It's a lovely way of thinking about it, So it's sort of like we generate abstract avatars of ourselves acting in the world, and if the avatar does something stupid, bang, we kill it off, and we don't implement it in our own bodies. That's smart. So basically we're throwing off abstract representations of ourselves so they can perish instead of us. Pretty cool.